Corporal Jake Matthews had been stationed on Velthury Prime for 3 months now, and every single night felt like it was getting harder to close his eyes. The war was over, or at least that's what Command kept telling them. The Terran Coalition had won. Humanity had proven itself as the dominant force in this sector of the galaxy. But standing here in the ruins of what used to be a thriving alien city, Jake wasn't sure what exactly they had won. The crystalline towers that once reached toward the purple sky now lay shattered across the streets like broken glass. The bioluminescent forests that the Velthury had cultivated for generations were scorched black from orbital strikes. Everything here had a sort of haunting beauty to it, even in its destruction. Jake's boots crunched over debris as he patrolled the edge of the refugee zone, his rifle hanging heavy across his chest. They called it peacekeeping duty. That's what his commanding officer had said during the morning briefing. But Jake knew better. This wasn't peace. This was occupation. The Velthury civilians who remained were herded into camps on the outskirts of their own capital city, living in makeshift shelters made from salvaged materials and emergency supplies. They weren't allowed to move freely. They weren't allowed to gather in groups larger than 5. They certainly weren't allowed out after the curfew that started at sundown. Jake's platoon rotated through these patrols every other night. It was supposed to be routine. Walk the perimeter. Check the restricted zones. Report any suspicious activity. But lately, the definition of suspicious activity had gotten broader and broader. Last week, Private Wilson had detained an elderly Velthury woman for carrying medical supplies. The week before that, Sergeant Hayes had called in a strike on a building because he thought he saw weapons being stored inside. Turned out it was farming equipment. The standing orders were clear though. Crystal clear. Command had lost too many soldiers in the final months of the war to guerrilla fighters and insurgents. The Velthury resistance had used every trick in the book, including sending children as scouts and couriers because human soldiers were less likely to fire on kids. At least that used to be true. Now the orders explicitly stated that any Velthury youth found in restricted zones after curfew was to be considered hostile. Age didn't matter. Appearance didn't matter. If they were there, they were a threat. Trust no one. That's what the briefings hammered into them day after day. They don't think like us. They don't value life the way we do. Their children are trained from birth to see humans as invaders. Show mercy and you'll end up with a knife in your back or a bomb in your hands. Jake had seen combat on 4 different worlds during this war. He'd watched his best friend die on Kepler Station when a surprise attack caught their unit off guard. He'd held wounded soldiers while they bled out waiting for evac. He knew the cost of hesitation in combat. He knew that split-second decisions could mean the difference between going home or going home in a box. But tonight, standing in this dark alley between 2 collapsed buildings, his rifle raised and his finger on the trigger, looking down at the small Velthury boy who couldn't have been more than 7 years old in human terms, Jake found that all those briefings and all those orders and all that training suddenly felt very far away. The boy's skin had that faint silver glow that all Velthury possessed, but it was dimmer than it should be. Malnutrition probably. His 4 thin arms were trembling as he clutched something wrapped in dirty cloth against his chest. Tears were streaming down his face, leaving luminescent trails on his cheeks. He wasn't moving. Wasn't running. Just standing there, frozen in terror, staring up at the human soldier who had him dead to rights. Jake's earpiece crackled. Command had eyes on this through the patrol drone circling overhead. They could see everything. Corporal Matthews, you have a confirmed target in restricted zone. Standing orders apply. Eliminate the threat. The boy made a small whimpering sound. His legs were shaking so badly Jake thought he might collapse. Eliminate the threat. That's what they wanted. That's what the orders said. This child was in a restricted zone after curfew. By definition, by regulation, by every rule that governed this occupation, he was an enemy combatant. Jake had followed orders for 18 months of brutal warfare. He'd done things he'd never thought he'd have to do. He'd become harder, colder, more efficient. That's what war did to you. That's what survival required. But looking at this terrified little boy, seeing the way his small hands clutched that bundle like it was the most precious thing in the world, seeing the absolute terror in his eyes, something inside Jake Matthews just broke. He'd spent 3 months telling himself that the Velthury were different, that they weren't really like humans, that the rules didn't apply the same way. But in this moment, all he could see was a scared kid who reminded him of his nephew back home. A child who was alone and frightened and probably starving. Jake's finger moved away from the trigger. His arms lowered slowly. The rifle pointed at the ground instead of at the boy's chest. Command was shouting in his ear now, demanding to know what he was doing, ordering him to follow protocol. He didn't answer them. Instead, Jake Matthews did something that would change everything. He holstered his rifle completely, took 2 steps forward, and extended his hand toward the alien child. The boy stared at Jake's outstretched hand like it might be a trap. His forearms pulled that cloth bundle even tighter against his thin chest. Jake could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, drowning out the angry voices coming through his earpiece. He kept his hand steady, kept his expression as gentle as he could manage. He'd never been great with kids, even human ones, but right now he needed this child to understand that he wasn't going to hurt him. Behind Jake, about 20 feet back, Private Beth Wilson was covering their position. She'd been his partner on these patrols for the last 6 weeks. Good soldier. Followed orders. Believed in the mission. And right now, her voice came hissing through the comm channel with barely controlled panic. Matthews, what the hell are you doing? Command is watching the drone feed. They can see everything. You need to complete the mission right now. Jake didn't respond. His hand stayed extended. The boy's eyes, large and golden like all Velthory, were locked on his face. Searching for something. Maybe trying to figure out if this was real or just another human trick. Jake, I'm serious, Beth continued, and he could hear her moving closer. You've got about 30 seconds before they send someone else to handle this. Don't throw away your career. Don't throw away everything. Just follow the damn orders. But Jake wasn't thinking about his career anymore. He was thinking about the last video call he'd had with his sister before shipping out to Velthory Prime. She'd held up her son, little Tommy, just turned 6 years old. The kid had wanted to show Uncle Jake his new toy spaceship. Had talked about how he wanted to be a soldier just like him when he grew up. Jake's sister had laughed and said she hoped the war would be over long before Tommy was old enough to enlist. This Velthory boy was probably the same age as Tommy. Maybe younger. Hard to tell with alien biology, but he had that same kind of innocence in his face. That same look kids get when they're too young to understand why the world can be so cruel. Jake knelt down slowly, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. The movement made the child flinch, but he didn't run. That was something. That was progress. It's okay, Jake said softly, even though he knew the boy couldn't understand English. The Velthory had their own language, all musical tones and subtle gestures with their multiple arms. But maybe tone of voice was universal. Maybe this kid could hear that Jake wasn't trying to hurt him. The bundle the boy was holding slipped slightly and something fell out onto the ground. Jake's eyes tracked the movement automatically, combat instincts always watching for weapons or explosives. But what hit the ground wasn't dangerous. It was a ration pack. Standard issue Terran military ration pack, the kind they handed out by the thousands to troops in the field. Jake's eyes moved back to the bundle. He could see more of them now that the cloth had shifted. 4, maybe 5 more ration packs. That's what this kid was clutching like treasure. Not weapons. Not intelligence. Not anything that could hurt anyone. Just food. The boy was scavenging stolen rations to survive. Command's voice exploded in Jake's earpiece. A different voice now, someone higher up the chain. Corporal Matthews, you are directly violating standing orders. Lower your weapon, step back, and allow us to handle the situation. This is your final warning before we classify you as non-compliant. Non-compliant. That was military speak for traitor. For someone who couldn't be trusted. Jake had heard about soldiers who went non-compliant during the war. They disappeared. Court-martialed. Dishonorably discharged if they were lucky. Prison time if they weren't. Beth was right next to him now. He could see her boots in his peripheral vision. Jake, please, she said, and her voice had lost that edge of anger. Now she just sounded scared. Scared for him. Just step back. Let me call this in properly. We can say the kid ran or something. We can figure this out. But you need to stop right now. Jake had spent 18 months following orders. 18 months doing what he was told without question. He'd fired on enemy positions when ordered. He'd cleared buildings. He'd called in airstrikes. He'd done everything a good soldier was supposed to do. He'd watched friends die because someone hesitated or didn't follow protocol quickly enough. He knew what the rules were. He knew why they existed. But he'd also spent the last 3 months watching what those rules looked like in practice during an occupation. He'd seen elderly Velthory beaten for moving too slowly at checkpoints. He'd seen families separated because their documentation wasn't in order. He'd seen supply convoys redirect food away from the refugee camps because command decided the civilians were getting too comfortable. He'd heard other soldiers joke about the aliens like they were animals. Like they didn't matter. Like their lives had no value. And he'd told himself it was necessary. That this was what victory looked like. That someone smarter than him, someone higher up the chain with better information, had decided this was the right way to handle things. He pushed down the doubts. He'd ignored the sick feeling in his stomach when he walked through the camps and saw children with hollow eyes and distended bellies. But he couldn't ignore it anymore. Not with this kid standing right in front of him, terrified and starving, guilty of nothing except trying to find food to survive. Jake's hand was still extended. The boy was still frozen. And in that moment, Jake Matthews made a choice that he knew would change his life forever. He made a choice between the soldier he'd been trained to be and the man he wanted to remain. "I'm sorry, Beth," he said quietly into the calm. Then he reached forward very slowly and gently placed his hand on top of the boy's head. The child flinched hard but didn't pull away. Jake let his hand rest there for a moment, then moved it to the boy's shoulder. "I'm sorry, Command," he continued. "But I'm not doing this." His other hand stayed extended between them. And after what felt like an eternity, one of the boy's small four-fingered hands reached out and wrapped around Jake's fingers. The child's hand was freezing cold and impossibly tiny. But the grip was real. The trust, however fragile, was real. Jake stood up slowly, keeping hold of that small hand. He looked at Beth, saw the horror and disbelief on her face. "I need you to decide something now," he told her. "Either help me or report me. But I'm not leaving this kid here to die." Beth's face went through about 6 different emotions in 3 seconds. Her hand moved to her rifle. For a heartbeat, Jake thought she might actually shoot him. Then she closed her eyes and lowered her weapon. "You're insane," she whispered. "We're both going to end up in prison." "Maybe," Jake agreed. He picked up the ration packs that had fallen and tucked them back into the boy's bundle. Then he scooped the child up into his arms. The kid was way too light. Definitely malnourished. "But I can live with that." He started walking, not toward the command post where he was supposed to bring detainees, but deeper into the civilian quarter, toward the refugee camps where maybe, just maybe, he could find this boy's family. Where maybe he could do one thing right in this entire miserable occupation. Beth stood there for another moment, and Jake could hear commands screaming in both their earpieces now, demanding compliance, threatening consequences. Then Beth cursed under her breath and jogged to catch up with him. "If we're doing this, we need to move fast," she said. "And we need to ditch these comms before they track us." Jake nodded and ripped the earpiece out, dropped it on the ground. Beth did the same. And together, with a terrified alien child who just learned that maybe not all humans were monsters, they disappeared into the ruins of a conquered city. Jake had maybe 40 minutes before the military police caught up with them. Maybe less. Command knew exactly where they ditched their earpieces, and every patrol drone in a 5-mile radius was probably being redirected to their last known position. He needed to move fast, but he also had no idea where he was going. The refugee camps were massive, sprawling networks of temporary shelters and collapsed buildings. Finding this kid's family in there would be like finding a needle in a haystack. Except the kid seemed to know where he was going. The boy, still clutched in Jake's arms, started making soft sounds and pointing with 2 of his 4 hands. Not words exactly, but urgent little noises that clearly meant something. Jake followed the direction the child was pointing, Beth covering their 6 and checking every corner like they were back in active combat. They moved through the ruins quickly. The architectural style of the Velthory was nothing like human construction. Everything was curved and organic, like the buildings had been grown rather than built. Even destroyed, there was something beautiful about it. But Jake didn't have time to appreciate alien aesthetics. He was too busy becoming a deserter. "You know we're never going back from this, right?" Beth said as they ducked through a collapsed archway. Her voice was tight, controlled, but Jake could hear the fear underneath. "The moment we ditched those comms, we crossed a line. They're going to label us traitors." "I know," Jake said simply. The boy in his arms had stopped crying but was still trembling. Jake tried to hold him gently, the way he'd seen his sister hold Tommy when the kid had nightmares. "I'm sorry I dragged you into this." "Shut up," Beth replied, but there wasn't any heat in it. "I made my choice. I just want to make sure you understand what we're doing here. This isn't some small infraction. This is treason in wartime. They could execute us for this." Jake knew she was right. He'd seen the regulations. Any soldier who aided the enemy during occupation could face capital punishment. And right now, Command would definitely classify this as aiding the enemy. He was helping an alien child who'd been caught in a restricted zone. By the book, that made him a traitor to humanity. The thought should have terrified him. Maybe it would later. But right now, all he felt was a strange sense of clarity. For 3 months, he'd felt like he was losing pieces of himself. Every order he followed, every checkpoint he manned, every time he looked away when other soldiers roughed up civilians, he felt something inside him dying. Maybe this was him trying to save whatever was left. The boy made another urgent sound and pointed down a narrow passage between 2 buildings. Jake hesitated. The passage was dark, barely wide enough for him to fit through with the kid in his arms. Could be a trap. Could be leading them straight into an ambush. But the child's golden eyes were locked on that darkness like it meant safety. "Your call?" Beth said, rifle up and ready. Jake took a breath and went in. The passage twisted and turned, getting narrower in some places, opening up in others. They walked for what felt like forever but was probably only 3 or 4 minutes. Then suddenly they emerged into what looked like a courtyard, except it was completely hidden from above by the wreckage of a building that had collapsed across the top like a roof. And it wasn't empty. There were Velthari everywhere. Dozens of them. Maybe over 100. Adults and children, all moving with purpose through this hidden space. Jake's hand instinctively moved toward his rifle, but he forced himself to freeze. He was surrounded. If these people wanted him dead, he'd be dead before he could get a shot off. Beth pressed close to his back and he could feel her tension. They were deep in enemy territory now, completely cut off from any support. This could go very bad very fast. But then the boy in Jake's arms made a loud, musical sound. A call maybe. Or a name. And from across the courtyard, a female Velthari looked up. Her skin was the same silver tone as the boy's. Her 4 arms covered in the intricate patterns that Jake had learned meant she came from one of the educated castes. She was thin, too thin like everyone here. But her eyes went wide when she saw the child. She ran toward them, and every protective instinct in Jake's body screamed at him to put the kid down and draw his weapon. But he held steady. The woman reached them and immediately began speaking in rapid Velthari, her hands moving in complex gestures. The boy squirmed in Jake's arms, reaching for her, and Jake carefully handed him over. The woman clutched the child to her chest, all 4 arms wrapping around him, and Jake could see tears streaming down her face. She was saying something over and over, the same phrase, and even though Jake didn't speak the language, he understood. "Thank you." She was thanking him. More Velthari were gathering now, forming a loose circle around them. Jake could see the suspicion and fear in their faces. He was wearing Terran military gear, carrying Terran weapons. To them, he represented everything that had destroyed their world. He half expected them to attack, and honestly he wouldn't have blamed them. But instead, an older Velthari male stepped forward. He was tall for his species, his skin darker than the others, marked with scars that suggested he'd seen combat. He studied Jake and Beth for a long moment, then spoke in heavily accented but understandable English. "You are coalition soldiers. Why you bring child here? Why you not kill?" The blunt question hit Jake harder than he expected. Because that's what they did, wasn't it? That's what the Velthari expected from human soldiers. Because he's just a kid, Jake said quietly. He was hungry. That's not a crime. The old Velthari's expression was impossible to read. Then he said something in his own language to the crowd around them. There was a moment of tense silence. Then slowly the circle of Velthari opened up. Not attacking. Not welcoming exactly. But not hostile either. "Come," the old male said. "We talk. Learn why human soldiers suddenly grow conscience." There was bitterness in his voice but also something else. Curiosity maybe. Or desperate hope. He led them deeper into the hidden courtyard, and as Jake followed, he started to see what Command had insisted didn't exist. This wasn't a terrorist cell or an insurgent hideout. This was a community. There were children playing in a corner under the watchful eyes of adults. There was a medical area where injured Velthari were being treated with improvised supplies. There was even what looked like a school with young ones sitting in a circle while an elder taught them something. These people had built a life here in the ruins. They'd created safety in the middle of an occupation that wanted them gone. And Jake and Beth had just stumbled into the middle of it. The old male led them to a partially intact building and gestured for them to sit. Jake and Beth exchanged a glance. This could still be a trap. But they'd come this far. Might as well see it through. As they sat, the woman who'd taken the boy appeared again. She was calmer now, though she kept the child close. She spoke to Jake in halting English, clearly struggling with each word. "I am Lyra. This is Ryvan, my brother. Thank you for his life. Commands say all humans want us dead. You show this not true." Jake felt something twist in his chest. "Not all of us," he said quietly. "Some of us still remember why we're supposed to be soldiers. To protect people. Not to hurt them." Lyra's golden eyes studied his face like she was trying to determine if he was lying. Then she said something that made Jake realize just how deep the propaganda had gone on both sides. "We are told humans have no souls. That you are machines made of meat. That you cannot feel love or mercy. I see my brother crying in your arms. I see you choose his life over your orders. Maybe we are told lies too. And that's when Jake understood. Both sides had been lied to. Both sides had been taught to see the other as monsters. And somewhere in all that hatred and propaganda, the truth had been completely lost. The Velthari weren't evil. They were just people trying to survive. And humans weren't all genocidal invaders. Some of them still had lines they wouldn't cross. Beth leaned close and whispered, "Jake, this is bigger than we thought. These people aren't insurgents. They're refugees. Families. And Command is treating them like enemy combatants." Jake nodded slowly. He'd started this night thinking he was just saving one kid. But he was beginning to realize he'd stumbled onto something much more important. A truth that Command didn't want anyone to see. And once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Jake spent 3 days in that hidden courtyard, and every hour changed him in ways he couldn't have predicted. Command had declared him a deserter by the end of the first night. Beth too. Their faces were probably on every military database in the sector by now, marked as traitors who'd aided enemy combatants. But sitting here watching Velthari children play games that weren't so different from hopscotch, hearing families share their meager food supplies with each other, Jake found it hard to care about what Command thought anymore. Lyra became their guide through this underground world. Her English was rough but improving by the hour, and she seemed determined to show them everything. She took them to the medical tent where a former Velthari physician was treating injured civilians with supplies that had clearly been scavenged from human military dumps. She showed them the school where children were being taught history and mathematics and art, because even in the middle of occupation, these people refused to let their culture die. But what hit Jake the hardest was the orphan section. Rows and rows of children who'd lost their families in the orbital bombardments or the ground fighting that followed. Some were old enough to understand what had happened. Others were too young, still waiting for parents who would never come back. The caretakers did their best, but there were just too many kids and not enough adults. Not enough food. Not enough medicine. Not enough hope. Command is planning something, Beth told him on the second night. She'd managed to hack into a military frequency using some jury-rigged equipment that one of the Velthari tech specialists had put together. They're calling it a relocation operation. Every refugee in this sector is supposed to be moved to detention facilities up north, in the Arctic regions. Jake felt his stomach drop. He'd seen reports about the Arctic facilities. They were barely heated. Minimal food supplies. No medical care to speak of. For a species like the Velthari that needed warmth and specific nutrients, being sent there was essentially a death sentence. When? He asked. 2 weeks. Maybe less. Beth looked sick. Jake, we're talking about thousands of people. Families. Children. They're going to freeze to death up there and Command knows it. They just don't care. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Ryvan, the little boy he'd saved. About Lyra and her determination to protect her brother. About all those orphans waiting for parents who'd never return. He'd joined the military to protect people. To stand between innocent civilians and the dangers of the universe. But somehow he'd ended up being part of the danger instead. The next morning something unexpected happened. Beth's hacked comm system picked up a transmission from a Terran patrol unit about 15 miles away. But this wasn't a standard military communication. It was a group of soldiers asking if anyone knew how to make contact with the defectors. With Jake and Beth. There are others, Beth said, her eyes wide. Other soldiers who are questioning orders. They want to talk. Over the next 48 hours, the trickle became a flood. First it was just a handful of soldiers. A fire team here, a patrol unit there. People who'd seen the leaked drone footage of Jake lowering his weapon and taking Ryvan's hand. That video had somehow made it past military censorship and was spreading through underground networks. Human civilians back on Earth were seeing it. Soldiers on other occupied worlds were seeing it. And it was making people ask questions that Command didn't want answered. Private Derek Hayes was the first to arrive at the hidden courtyard. He deserted his post 2 days earlier after being ordered to fire on a group of Velthari civilians who were protesting food rationing. I couldn't do it, he told Jake, his hands shaking. They were just standing there with signs. No weapons. No threat. Just asking for enough food to feed their kids. And my CO wanted me to gun them down. Then came Corporal Amy Winters and her entire squad. She'd been stationed at one of the refugee processing centers and had watched as families were separated, as the elderly were denied medical care, as children were taken from their parents with no documentation of where they were going. This isn't peacekeeping, she said bluntly. This is ethnic cleansing with better PR. Within a week, there were over 50 deserters in the underground network. Within 2 weeks, over 200. And they weren't joining some insurgent group or picking up arms against their former comrades. They were doing something more radical than that. They were standing between Command's orders and the civilians those orders targeted. They were saying no. Command's response was predictable. They sent in military police to arrest the deserters. But when those MPs arrived and saw what was really happening in the refugee camps, when they saw the children and the families and the desperate conditions people were living in, some of them deserted too. Not all of them. Maybe not even most of them. But enough that the desertion problem started spreading like wildfire. Back on Earth, the political situation was getting ugly. The leaked footage of Jake and Riven had sparked massive protests. Parents looked at that terrified alien child and saw their own kids. They asked why their sons and daughters in uniform were being ordered to shoot children, regardless of what species those children belonged to. Veterans from previous wars started speaking out, questioning the occupation policies, demanding answers about what their military was really doing on these conquered worlds. Jake found himself in a position he'd never wanted and definitely wasn't qualified for. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't a politician. He was just a soldier who'd made one choice in an alley and couldn't back down from the consequences. But somehow he'd become the face of something bigger than himself. The deserters looked to him for guidance. The Velthari saw him as proof that not all humans were monsters. And Command saw him as the most dangerous threat to their occupation strategy. Lyra helped Jake understand something crucial during one of their long conversations. Through her halting English and patient explanations, she revealed that the Velthari empire that humanity had gone to war against wasn't what they'd been told. The Velthari weren't a unified, authoritarian threat. They'd been a democratic federation that was in the middle of a brutal civil war when human forces arrived. There had been a fascist faction trying to take over, and the civilians had been fighting against it. But humanity had seen the conflict and assumed all Velthari were the enemy. They'd attacked without understanding the situation. They'd sided with neither faction and instead decided to conquer everyone. The very people who would have been humanity's natural allies ended up getting bombed and occupied alongside the actual authoritarians. "We were fighting for freedom," Lyra explained one night, her four hands gesturing in the Velthari way that expressed deep frustration. "Fighting against leaders who wanted to control everything. Then humans came and said we all same. All bad. All must be controlled. You became the thing we were fighting against." The realization was crushing. The entire war had been built on misunderstanding and incomplete intelligence. Thousands of human soldiers had died. Millions of Velthari had died. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. And it had all been one massive tragic mistake. But Jake was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to fix it. The deserters weren't just protecting civilians anymore. They were building something new. A bridge between two species that had been taught to hate each other. Human soldiers were teaching Velthari civilians defensive tactics while Velthari engineers were sharing their technology and knowledge with humans who actually bothered to listen. And in the center of it all was a little boy named Riven, who'd gone from being marked for execution to becoming the symbol of what cooperation between humans and Velthari could look like. He'd started following Jake everywhere, learning English words, teaching Jake bits of Velthari language in return. The kid was smart, curious, and surprisingly resilient for someone who'd been through so much trauma. On the 15th day after Jake's desertion, Command made their move. They sent an elite strike team to eliminate what they were now calling the insurgent leadership. Which meant they were coming to kill Jake and the other deserters. Consequences for the Velthari civilians caught in the crossfire be damned. But something had changed in those 15 days. The movement had grown too large to eliminate with one strike. There were deserters on 30 different occupied worlds now, all refusing to follow relocation orders, all standing between Command and the civilians they'd sworn to protect. Taking out Jake wouldn't stop it anymore. The revolution had outgrown its accidental leader. Command realized too late that executing a popular soldier on live feeds would only create a martyr. The political pressure from Earth was too intense. The protests too widespread. They needed a different approach. They needed to negotiate. And Jake, who just wanted to save one kid in an alley, suddenly found himself sitting across from coalition generals, about to negotiate terms for a peace that nobody had thought possible. The meeting took place in what used to be the Velthari Hall of Unity, a massive building that had somehow survived most of the orbital bombardment. Its walls were still scorched black in places and half the roof had collapsed, but it was neutral ground. More importantly, it was public. Whatever happened here would be watched by millions of people across dozens of worlds. Command couldn't make Jake disappear quietly, and Jake couldn't back down without betraying everyone who trusted him. General Patricia Hayes sat across the table from Jake, and the woman looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, her expression carefully controlled, but Jake could see the exhaustion in her eyes. Behind her stood a row of coalition officers, all of them looking at Jake like he was something they'd scraped off their boots. On Jake's side of the table sat Lyra, representing the Velthari Civilian Council, and Beth, who'd somehow become his unofficial second-in-command in this whole mess. And standing right next to Jake, holding his hand with two of his four small hands, was Ryvan. The boy had refused to stay behind, and honestly Jake was glad he was there. Ryvan reminded everyone in that room what this was really about. Not politics. Not military strategy. Just a kid who deserved to live. General Hayes spoke first. Her voice was crisp, professional, completely devoid of emotion. Corporal Matthews, you stand accused of desertion, treason, and aiding enemy combatants during a time of occupation. Under normal circumstances, you would face a military tribunal and likely execution. However, due to the unique political situation surrounding your case, the coalition is prepared to offer terms. Jake waited. He'd learned over the past month that sometimes silence was more powerful than words. Hayes continued, clearly uncomfortable with the pause. We're prepared to offer you a full pardon. You and all soldiers who deserted under your influence. Complete restoration of rank and benefits. You'll be transferred to a non-combat position, allowed to serve out your term quietly, and then honorably discharged. All we ask is that you stand down, encourage the other deserters to return to duty, and allow us to proceed with the relocation operations as planned. The offer hung in the air. It was more generous than Jake had expected. Command was basically offering to pretend none of this had happened if he'd just go away quietly. 6 months ago he probably would have taken it, would have been grateful for it. But that was before he'd spent a month living with the Velthari. Before he'd seen what the occupation really looked like from the other side. Before he'd held Ryvan's hand and promised, in broken words and gestures, that he'd keep the boy safe. No, Jake said simply. Hayes blinked like she'd misheard him. Excuse me? I said no. I'm not taking your deal. Jake kept his voice calm, steady. You want to relocate thousands of people to Arctic detention facilities where you know they'll die. You want to separate families, take children from their parents and call it peacekeeping. I won't help you do that. Neither will any of the other soldiers who've joined this movement. One of the officers behind Hayes stepped forward, face red with anger. You're in no position to make demands, Corporal. You're a traitor. We're offering you your life back and you're spitting in our faces. Then court-martial me, Jake shot back. Do it right here, right now, in front of all the cameras. Show everyone back on Earth exactly what happens to soldiers who refuse to kill children. I'm sure that'll go over great with the voting population. The officer looked like he wanted to lunge across the table, but Hayes held up a hand to stop him. She studied Jake for a long moment, then her eyes moved to Ryvan. The little boy stared back at her with those big golden eyes, completely unafraid. Or maybe just too young to understand how much danger he was in. What do you want? Hayes asked quietly. The professional mask had cracked just a little. She sounded tired. Human. Jake glanced at Lyra, who nodded slightly. They'd discussed this. Planned for it. Hoped it might be possible but never really believed Command would listen. We want the occupation to end, Jake said. We want the relocation orders cancelled. We want the refugee camps opened up so people can start rebuilding their cities. We want joint human Velthari councils to govern the reconstruction efforts instead of military rule. That's not a negotiation, that's a demand for surrender, one of the other officers snapped. No, Lyra spoke up, her English clearer now after weeks of practice. Is demand for peace. Real peace. Not conqueror controlling conquered. Partnership. Cooperation. Both species working together to fix what war destroyed. Hayes leaned back in her chair. The coalition will never agree to that. We won this war. We don't give up our victory just because one soldier got sentimental about an alien kid. You didn't win anything, Beth interjected, speaking for the first time. You conquered a bunch of civilians who were already fighting a civil war against the actual threat. The fascist faction you were worried about? They were the minority. Most Velthari were fighting against them. We attacked the wrong people and now we're occupying allies we could have had. Hayes's expression flickered. Just for a second, Jake saw something that looked like doubt. Like maybe she'd heard this theory before. Like maybe some people in Command had known the truth all along but decided conquest was easier than admitting they'd made a mistake. Even if that were true, Hayes said slowly, we can't just withdraw. The coalition spent too many resources on this war. Lost too many soldiers. The public back home expects something to show for all that sacrifice. Then give them this, Jake said, gesturing around the ruined hall. Give them a story about how humanity learned from its mistakes. How we turned a war into a partnership. How we proved that we're better than just another conquering species. He paused, then added quietly, give them a reason to be proud of their military again instead of ashamed. The room went silent. Jake could hear the wind whistling through the broken roof, could hear the distant sounds of the city outside where Velthory and human deserters were working together to clear rubble and rebuild homes. Could hear Riven's soft breathing as the boy leaned against his leg, tired from standing so long. General Hayes closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, something had changed. I can't promise anything, she said. This goes above my authority. Way above. But I'll take your proposal to the Coalition Council. I'll advocate for it. I can't guarantee they'll listen. That's all we're asking, Jake said. A chance. That's more than the Velthory have gotten so far. The negotiations continued for 3 more weeks. Jake wasn't involved in most of it. Turned out that being good at saying no to bad orders didn't make him a diplomat. Actual politicians and negotiators took over, with Lyra representing the Velthory civilian government and Beth representing the deserters who'd become something between peacekeepers and mediators. Jake spent most of those 3 weeks in the refugee camps, helping with reconstruction, learning more Velthory language from Riven, and trying to process everything that had happened. He'd gone from a soldier following orders to a deserter, from a deserter to a symbol, and from a symbol to what? A catalyst maybe? A person who'd been in the right place at the right time to do the right thing, even though it terrified him. The final agreement wasn't perfect. It never could be. Too many people on both sides wanted complete victory instead of compromise. The hardliners in the coalition thought Hayes had given away too much. The Velthory radicals thought the civilian council had accepted too little. But it was peace. Real, actual peace. The occupation would end over a 6-month period. Joint human Velthory governance councils would be established in every major city. Coalition forces would withdraw but leave behind volunteer advisors to help with reconstruction. The Velthory would get their world back, and humanity would get something more valuable than another conquered planet. They'd get a partner. An ally. A chance to prove they could be more than just another aggressive species with big guns. The day the withdrawal officially began, Jake stood in that same refugee camp where he'd first brought Riven. Except it wasn't really a camp anymore. People were moving back into the city, reclaiming their homes or building new ones where the old ones had been destroyed. Human engineers were working alongside Velthory architects, trying to blend human practicality with Velthory aesthetics. It was messy and chaotic and beautiful. Riven tugged on Jake's hand. The boy had grown over the past months, was speaking pretty decent English now, and had started attending one of the new integrated schools where human and Velthory children learned together. You go home now? Riven asked, using the same question he'd asked a dozen times over the past weeks. Jake looked around at the city rising from the ashes. At the humans and Velthory working together. At Beth, who'd stuck with him through everything and was now being offered a position as a liaison officer in the new joint government. At Lyra, who'd become one of his closest friends despite them starting as enemies. At all the people, human and alien, who'd risked everything because they believed peace was possible. He thought about Earth. About his sister and nephew Tommy. About the quiet suburban life he'd left behind when he enlisted. He could go back to that now. His record had been cleared. His service would be listed as exemplary rather than traitorous. He could go home and try to forget about war and occupation and all the hard choices that had brought him here. But when he looked down at Riven, at this kid who'd been seconds from execution and now had a future full of possibilities, Jake knew what his answer was. I am home, he said quietly, and he meant every word. Riven's face split into a huge smile, showing all those sharp little teeth that had terrified human soldiers when they'd first encountered the Velthory. The boy hugged Jake's leg fiercely, then ran off to play with a group of other children, human and Velthory mixed together like it was the most natural thing in the world. Maybe someday it would be. Maybe this generation of kids would grow up not seeing each other as alien or enemy, just as people. Different people, sure, with different biology and different cultures. But people who could live together, work together, build something better than what their parents had almost destroyed. Jake had enlisted to protect humanity. But standing here in the ruins of a conquered city that was learning to become free again, he realized that protecting humanity meant more than just keeping humans safe. It meant making sure humanity was worth protecting. Making sure they lived up to the ideals they claimed to represent. Making sure that when they reached out their hands to other species, it was in friendship rather than violence. He'd been ordered to shoot a crying alien boy. Instead, he'd taken his hand. And that single choice, that one moment of mercy in a war full of cruelty, had changed everything. Not because Jake was special or brave or heroic. But because sometimes all it takes to start a revolution is one person refusing to do the wrong thing, even when everyone else says it's necessary. The human soldier had become a bridge. And maybe, just maybe, that was humanity's real strength after all.